Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Celtic Way Sit Down with me, Ryan McGinlay. And as you can see, I've got a very special guest with me today, a familiar face to those who watch Celtic YouTube videos. It's Ryan Fitzsimons at Ryan Stephen F2. Ryan, how are you doing today?
Thanks very much, mate. I feel slightly, I don't know, overrated when you say a very special guest, but I'm doing well, mate. Thanks for having me along. It's a pleasure.
No bother at all. And today we're going to be talking about the Celtic moments that made you your sort of top five Celtic moments in being a supporter of the club. But before we start, if I could just direct everybody's attention to the bottom of the screen. If you subscribe to the Celtic Way website and support top quality football journalism covering the club you love at www.celticway.co.uk/subscribe, you'll get articles from myself, from Tony Haggerty, from Aidan McDonald. You'll have stats pieces from Duco James, from Alan Morrison, and scouting pieces from Stuart Ross. It really helps us if you subscribe, keeps us doing these special videos and morning briefings as well. So if you're interested, then please go and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Down at the bottom there, and you'll get notified of whenever we go live or whenever new videos come out. So we'll just get right on to this, Ryan. So just as sort of a general statement, when did you start supporting Celtic? When was the earliest memory, you would say?
Oh God. Well, it's been a lifetime thing, hasn't it? You're kind of born into supporting Celtic as long as you know your parents, your dad or whatever's a Celtic fan. So I guess you could say it's been a lifetime thing. But for me, when it starts becoming kind of, you can start remembering stuff and your memory kicks in. I think when Gordon Strachan was first appointed manager of Celtic, I think that was a nice way to say that that's the era I first remembered. I was pretty young for Martin O'Neill, Seville, Henrik Larsson, and all of that, which is a shame. I wish that I had memories of that era because it was so successful. But no, for me, I'd probably say that kind of 2006, 2007 sort of time. And obviously, once again, another very successful era for Celtic, so it was a good time to get into supporting the club.
Yeah, absolutely. I seem to remember that time as well. I think me and you have got the same sort of Celtic consciousness, where I can
Mm.
remember people from before, can remember sort of fleetingly appearances by Larson. I can remember kind of watching Seville, but not really being into football too
Aye.
much. I think it was when I was properly getting into FIFA 07, FIFA 08. It was when I started to get properly into Celtic. Guys like Nakamura, I'm sure
Yep.
you would have remembered guys like Nakamura, Neil Lennon as the captain, Stephen McManus at the back as well. I think you're just like me with regard to growing up with those sort of players, aren't you?
Aye, those are like, my dad, he's fortunate enough to say that he grew up watching the Lisbon Lions, so he has his Bertie Alls, his Billy McNeils, his Jimmy Johnsons, but for me it's as simple as my Artur Boric's, my Shinsuke Nakamura's, and all those kind of guys. And listen, for as good as the Lisbon Lions is, I must say, I'm happy with the crop of players I've got, because there was some that gave some great memories to me being young, and like, I'm a big nostalgia man, I love my nostalgia, and those guys are some names I look back on really fondly.
Yeah, as a man, we talk about that on the podcast that me and you do as well. But
Hmm.
just talking about before we get started on your top five list that you've kindly given to me before we started recording, is there any honourable mentions that you didn't mention in that top five list that you would like to talk about before we start?
Oh God, it's so, we are so lucky, aren't we? Because like, we've grew up in a generation where Celtic have just been so successful. They've created so many memories, and that goes across, domestic competition, European competition. I guess some of the big ones that I've left out my list, for example, was like the Tony Watt goal and the night against Barcelona. I didn't include that in my list purely down to the fact I wasn't actually at that game, which is probably one of my only regrets as a Celtic fan, growing up, the fact that I wasn't at that game. So that's a standout one. Another one of the standouts for me, and it was one that I really felt harsh leaving off, was the game against Rangers at Celtic Park back in 2007-8 season, with Nakamura scoring the absolute cracker past Alan McGregor. That was a huge standout. That, I think that for me might be the first ever derby game I properly remember sitting and watching with my dad and getting right into it and understanding the context of the rivalry. So I remember when Nakamura scored that night, me and my dad, we flew off the couch, and that always sticks in my head. And I felt really harsh including it, but I think those two are probably two of the big standouts that I've not put in there.
Yeah, and those really are two big standouts in terms of big games. But the first game that you've given me is actually not really too much of a standout game. I'm guessing it's more of a nostalgia factor.
Yeah.
You're very the first game that you're giving me was Celtic versus Inverness in 2009. I think it was Sean Maloney that scored the only goal in that game.
Yep.
What would you like to talk about with regards to that? I think it was that Gordon Strachan's last season at the club?
It would have been 2008-9, so yeah, it would have been because Mowbray would have came in the following season. So it obviously wasn't a very memorable season for Celtic either. It wasn't the greatest, but that game obviously stands out to me because it was the first ever Celtic game I got to. It was the first time I ever got a ticket. I was a bit of a late bloomer. My dad never took me to a game until I was 8 years old, which, you know, a lot of people get to. You go to the games now and you see newborns at the games, never mind, you know, 8-year-olds. So, like, I was a bit of a late bloomer getting to my first game. My dad finally got us a ticket and we went along for what it wasn't a very memorable one, but as you said, it's one that just sticks out in the mind.
Yeah, it's that sort of football consciousness. Was there anything that sticks out with regards to going to the game, of going with your dad? Is there anything that sticks out in your head about that journey to the game or the excitement about going to Celtic Park? Even though it was only a game against Inverness Castle, you know, there's been quite a few of those games throughout the years. But is there anything in that game, even the journey before, after the game, how you felt with regards to the whole overall experience with going to that game?
Yeah, it's obviously, it's kind of like, you know, it's one of those things. As long as you're old enough to remember it, it's one of those things you'll never forget. Your first ever game for, and that kind of resonates for all football supporters, no matter if you're a Celtic fan or, you know, any team. You go to these games for the first time, it's always going to be one that sticks in your memory. But it's just, you know, walking down the route that we take to the game anyway, you know, walking down Springfield Road for the first time, it's crazy because it feels so alien. You know, I can remember 8-year-old me being like, oh my god, there's so many people, this is so weird, I'm going to Celtic Park. But then later, little do you know that later in life that's going to become the norm. That's going to be your life, going there every week. So walking down Springfield Road, I remember getting my first ever Celtic scarf. It sticks out. I had that for years. Funnily enough, just a wee side note, I remember I got that first ever Celtic scarf and my dad got me it. And I'm a very sentimental person. Like, I like things and I like wee stories, and I had it every single game I went to up until Ronnie Dyler's last ever game in charge. So for that game against Inverness, up until Ronnie Dyler's last game, and I left it in the stadium and I never got it back, and I was fuming about it because it was my first ever scarf. But that sticks out in your head, and then ultimately the first ever time you walk through the turnstiles and get to your seat, it blows you away because Celtic Park's obviously an incredibly impressive venue, a 60,000 seater. It was my first time seeing it in the flesh and not on the telly, well, through the gates anyway. And it just kind of blows you away. And one of the wee funny things for the game as well is, you know, looking back now, everybody knows my YouTube channel name is Ryan118, and it has no relation whatsoever to my name. But it turns out that, and the ticket's downstairs as well, I've got it framed. My first ever game was sat in section 118. And I look back at that now and I'm like, that's crazy, because it's got nothing to do. It's not the reason my channel's called Ryan118. I'm like, that's mad that somehow along the way that the paths crossed. So there's a whole bunch of factors, but it's just that overall unique experience. And then, of course, Gone with Your Old Man as well is something that is really special.
Yeah, especially for the both of us. I still go to the games with my dad, so I know exactly how that feels. It seems as if the sort of Celtic stars aligned with regards to the 118 in your name and the 118 in terms of the turnstiles. It's quite mad how things like that just turn out and they work in that way. Just looking back to the team back then, it would have been, was it Scott McDonald up front? I remember the top. It was the green and white hoops, but I think it was with the yellow sort of collar.
Yeah.
I seem to remember that. I'm trying to think of other players that were in the team. I think
I've got the full team sheet in front of me if you want me to run through the 11 very
Absolutely,
quickly.
Yeah, go for it.
So the starting 11 that day was Artur Boric in goals, who got a yellow card that day, very Artur Boric fashion to get a yellow card. Artur Boric. The back four was Andreas Hinkle, Gary Caldwell, Stephen McManus, and Barry Robson started at left back, and Lee Naylor came on later in the game for him. The midfield was Nakamura, Paul Hartley, Scott Brown, and Sean Maloney, and then up front was Samaras and McDonald. And off the bench that day, Killian Sheridan came on, and then I think he got substituted literally 3 minutes later for Koki Mizuno. So we had a wee quick double sub in there, probably injury related, but don't ask me for certain because I don't remember.
I'm hoping it was an injury. Although it must have been a pretty terrible 3 minute performance. It was tactical based, honestly. I remember Koki Mizuno as well. I think he was the second Japanese player to play for Celtic after Nakamura. Obviously, Nakamura was playing in that game too, but there's a bigger Japanese contingent nowadays than there was back then. But even then, you hear about the Japanese players from now talking about Nakamura and Koki Mizuno as well, to be fair. Would you say those two are trailblazers for the current Japanese crop of players currently plying their trade at Celtic?
Absolutely, and look, listen, even when you just take Japan aside from it for a minute, that squad has a few trailblazers in there, because you look at somebody like Artur Boric, who, when we've just signed, of course, Nawrocki from Legia Warsaw, right, and he's spoke about Artur Boric already. You look at somebody like Scott McDonald, little did we think we'd go on to have such a big Australian link, a decade on, but in particular those two Japanese boys, it's a team of trailblazers, and back then, the talent that we've seen in those guys, it's no wonder that we're now exploring these markets in much deeper detail, because there's so many players out there who are, out to improve this team. And we've done a good job at looking into all these different places where we might have neglected in the past.
Yeah, I always find it quite weird as well when you hear players such as, you hear Steve McManus, and he's now co-manager of the B team. You get Barry Robson, who's the Aberdeen manager. It shows you just how much time flies, even in a short period of time. I mean, what was that? Under 15 years ago, and now they're all plying their trade. They're still in Scotland, but they're plying their trade. Some of them are for Celtic and others for Aberdeen. And Barry Robson, by all accounts, is doing a really good job with Aberdeen. Anything else before we move on to the next game? What do you remember of sort of Artur Boric? Was that when he was coming towards the end of his period as Celtic goalkeeper?
Yeah,
I know there was a bit of a downturn in his form.
That would have been his last season.
Fiorentina he moved to.
Yeah, that would have been his last season before he went to Fiorentina at Celtic. Honestly, I think that was, I didn't really touch on it when you asked about my memories of the game, but I think that for me might have been at the time the biggest highlight for me, because Artur Boric I've been very vocal on it. Most people know he's my favourite Celtic player probably in my lifetime. I love him to bits. So going along and getting to actually see him play, getting the chance before he left the club as well, that was huge for me. It was a shame, obviously, because his form did sort of dip in that last year or so before he left the club. Yellow card for time wasting. You've got to appreciate that. But once again, he was a cracking player, and I know the last kind of season there was a few blunders here and there, but he's someone that the support look on so fondly. They love him, and he's somebody that will always have a great association with Celtic.
Yeah, and we obviously, Celtic participated in his testimonial, his final ever game before his retirement last season. I think it was a 1-each draw with Legia Warsaw in Warsaw, so that was a good sort of occasion for him. I wouldn't maybe say a legend of the club, but one of Celtic's best modern day goalkeepers. Some massive moments both on and off the pitch. You would say he was definitely a firecracker of a player, but he was just a great goalkeeper in the prime of his career when he was at Celtic, and kept us in games in Europe. What a goalkeeper, and a goalkeeper that I think Celtic have struggled to replace in a lot of senses in terms of that presence at the back. It's difficult to replace a player like Artur Boric, but that I think
one of a kind, isn't he? One of a kind.
Yeah, even though I know you're a massive fan of Joe Hart and everything that he does, Artur Boric, what a servant for the club. Just moving on to your second moment or your second game was Shakhtar Karagandhi. Now, I think that was in 2013.
Yeah,
I think
August 2013. Yep.
Yeah, Celtic had lost 2-0 away from home in Kazakhstan, which was also Virgil van Dijk's debut. I remember a few people in the media were writing off Van Dijk after one game when he had a bit of a shocker.
Boy, did he look foolish now.
I know, best defender in the world for a good 5-6 years, you could say. So he done all right after that. I think he was alongside Stephen Moyakolo as well in the defence. That was the defence in that game. He was a free transfer from Wolves. Injuries plagued his career. I think he was number 22.
Whatever happened to Moyako? He just disappeared into thin air, it feels like.
Yeah, I know Nawrocki's got some big shoes to fill, because he was the last defender to have the number 22. So, no, it was Quad. It's Quad that's number 22 as well. So he doesn't need to worry about that.
So it is. Aye.
See, I'm getting mixed up with all these players because
there's too many shirt numbers being thrown about the last few days. We've been very active in the transfer market. It's no your fault, Ryan.
Yeah, absolutely. And see, to be fair, Kwon can probably play as a centre half with the size of him as well. So, watch this space. You don't want to play players out of position too much. But 6'3", you look at that could be a central defender. But that Carragandi game, 2-0 down, but you still felt as if Celtic were still in the tie, even 2-0 down, because of the way Celtic Park can be in these Champions League nights. Albeit it was only a qualifier, but this was the qualifier to get into the group stages of the Champions League. It was a massive game. Celtic knew what they had to do, and they went out and done it and did it in spectacular fashion. 3-0. That late goal from James Forrest after some amazing play by Anthony Stokes on the wing. What was your memories of this game? Because I remember being at this game and it went absolutely ballistic when Forrest scored that winner.
Oh, it was nuts, wasn't it? It was one of those ones that I had to put in just because of the absolute scenes that they say, the scenes at the end of the game, the crowd, the noise. It was I wasn't actually meant to go to this game, and I remember I was starting second year at the time, so I was only 13. And I was starting second year at the time, and it was one of the boys in my class who said, "Oh, I've got a spare ticket. Do you want to come?" And I was like, "Bugger it, aye." Even though I as you said, I felt like Celtic were in the tie, but there was part of me is like, I'm going to go here, and it's going to be heartbreak. It's going to be disappointment. We're going to be at the competition, but I thought, aye, we'll go. I'll go along. And boy, I'm glad I did, because that closing segment of the game. The reason I've got it in here is because it was one of being 13, right? It was weird, but it was probably one of the most emotional times I felt being a Celtic fan, just because I remember the 90th, after the final whistle went, 90 minutes had been played. They done their lap of honour around the park, as they always do, to like thank the fans, and they put on "You'll Never Walk Alone," and like I think there was just that relief in the crowd that we'd made it to the Champions League. Obviously big money for the club, attracts bigger players. We were just off the back of a very successful Champions League campaign the year before. If we missed out, I think that everybody would have felt so sort of downbeat about, not getting the chance to do it again. But the relief in "You'll Never Walk Alone," it nearly brought a tear to my eye. I was like, oh, we've made it, right? We're there. That's it. We've done it. That's all that matters. And it was one of James Forrest's biggest moments in a Celtic shirt as well. He's someone who's come under a lot of criticism through the years. He's been very hot and cold, and people have a really mixed opinion, a very polarising player. But that night, at such a young age as well, at the time as well, to stand up in a big moment and do something like that was huge, and we really needed it. So it was just one of those times that I just felt really connected to what was going on with the club, and I'll never forget that, to be honest.
Yeah, you talk about polarising players. It was three polarising goal scorers that night, you would say, when it comes to Chris Commons, more off the pitch stuff when it comes to Chris Commons, regards what he says in the media. But Samaras as well, who was the very definition of a player that blew hot and cold with regards to his form. We know how much of a world beater he can be on his day, but when he wasn't on form, he kind of stank the place out with his performances. And James Forrest, who did go hot and cold here, that's been his career as well. I think if he was more hot than cold, they would have moved away from Celtic. But he's had 2-3 really outstanding seasons where he scored a lot of goals. But it was a massive. I always remember the celebrations at the end when Neil Lennon goes and runs, and there's a massive huddle with all the players. I think it was Charlie Mulgrew that was going mental as well at full time.
Typical Mulgrew fashion.
Yeah, always there or thereabouts with all the celebrations that he was getting involved with. I seem to remember in that game as well. I don't know if it was 2-0 or 1-0, but Carragandi had a shot or a header or something like that, and it hit the post or hit the bar, and it looked as if it was going to go in. Now the amount of time it took for that to hit the bar and go out, or hit the post or whatever it was and go out of play, or went away from danger, it felt as if it was on for 20 seconds. It felt as if time stopped.
It was like a lifetime, wasn't it?
It was so, the nervousness in the stadium was so obvious. Everyone was nervous. Everyone was desperate. I think it also due to the fact that Rangers weren't in the league at that point. There needed to be some excitement in those midweek games as well, and that's what the Champions League would bring you. So to confirm our places in the Champions League in that fashion with Forrest, with a great finish, by the way, it's a phenomenal finish and quite an iconic modern day goal, you could say, by all accounts. Yeah, it was massive for the club, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely huge. I remember at the time Neil Lennon coming out and saying like it was the biggest thing that he'd done in football, like right after the game, and that just, I know a lot of people, yeah, it's easy to say things like that in the moment and emotion takes over, but it truly was one of those things that, as I said, when I got offered the ticket earlier in the day, I did not expect us to go through, because I remember in the first leg we were hopeless. I was like, right, well, we've gubbed it. There's no chance we're going to do it. And obviously Neil Lennon, he needed it. He wanted it badly. And that was one thing, for us, once again, we talk about polarising figures. Neil Lennon's up there as well, isn't he? He's one of the most polarising figures that we've seen in recent times, due to everything that happened through the COVID season, etc., etc. But that was one thing that he was really good at, was inspiring a squad and really inspiring the Celtic supporter, especially at that moment in time, at the height of his popularity at Celtic, you could say. He always gave you a reason to believe, and he would always give you a reason to be on his side and just have confidence. And that was one of those games that made you go, right, okay, let's do this, let's move forward, and let's get better.
Yeah, just following on from obviously qualifying for that group, I believe that was the group where Celtic drew Barcelona, Ajax, and AC Milan.
Yeah,
Was that
would have been.
When Kaka went back out on loan
Mm-hmm.
to AC Milan at that point? Yeah, I do remember that quite clearly, because I remember being quite excited to see all these different players at Celtic Park, including one of the most divisive players in modern football. When I was a massive fan of watching Neymar, I'd obviously followed them at Santos,
That would
and
have been
then
like his
after,
first visit, wouldn't it, to Celtic Park?
yeah, it would have been, yeah, because it was
Aye.
the whole Scott Brown incident as well that
Mm-hmm.
happened. I was a big fan before the game. After the game, it was a wee bit more difficult to be a fan of Neymar, but yeah,
It was easier for me because
Celtic's.
I never liked him for the get go, so I was there shouting abuse for the minute he walked on the park.
See, I think was it a Fabregas header that won them that game? I think it was only 1-0 or
It
2-0.
sounds right. Aye, it wasn't like a drubbing that we've seen in other times. It
No,
was it was
because
back when
Celtic were.
Celtic used to be a bit closer.
Because I remember, because it was the year after we'd obviously beat Barcelona 2-1 in that memorable game that you were talking about.
hmm
But it was a close game as well. And I remember before Scott Brown got sent off, Celtic were well in the game and they were giving it their all. They had
Yeah.
more possession than in that game against Barcelona, at least before the sending off. I know that sending off would have probably skewed the statistics with regard to that game, but Celtic were there. I remember Barcelona had that black kit on at the time, black
Yeah.
and yellow, I think it was, and then they got their winner, and it was one of those what if moments, really, but you knew that Celtic had that in them because they beat arguably a better team the season
hmm
before.
Yep, that's right, and that was one thing. Sometimes we're hoping now with Brendan Rodgers being back, we'll get closer to the field, and obviously there's a lot happening in football just now that's drifting some of the best players to another continent. So you're hoping the gap sort of closes itself naturally. But back then, there was like a and there still is. Listen, I think every Celtic fan will tell you they're optimistic going into these games. It might just be 5 or 10 minutes in they realise the optimism was probably unjust. But back then, especially, obviously after the Barcelona game in 2012, every time you went to Parkhead, man, it was special, because like you knew you could beat these sides, and obviously we got some huge results in those years, and even in that season we got the result against Ajax as well, and that's
Trial.
something I think we all desperately want back at Celtic Park sometime very soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Just before we get on to your third point, or the third game that we were going to talk about, we're going to talk about Brendan Rodgers' first period at the club. But
hmm
what's your sort of views on him being back at the club now that it's been sort of like a month or so since he was announced as manager for the second time? I know you were a big fan of Brendan Rodgers. You were
Yeah.
wanting him back pretty much as soon as he'd left the club. He did well down south with all his accolades and with Leicester. But how are you feeling a month or so into Brendan Rodgers being back at the club?
Yeah, good. I mean, obviously, as you said, it was no secret that's who I wanted for the job. I made it very clear that there was one man for me, and that was him. But I'm happy. Look, I'm just buzzing that we're very close now to the actual season kicking off, the competitive games. Because obviously, I think there's been a good majority, well, not a majority, there's been a good amount of fans who've had their sort of their I don't know, they've just been a little bit reserved and trying to get their excitement going, because maybe signings haven't been what they've expected, or the pre-season friendlies weren't exactly what they expected. But when the real football starts, that's when I think we'll get to smile, and we'll all be happy with what we see. I think that he's come in and he's reassured us of what his plan is for the next few years. I'm very happy with how it's going so far. And look, remember in that first media press conference, even he said, "I'll guarantee I'm here for 3 years." If the tools so far that have been given to him stay consistent over the next few years, then I think it's going to be a very fun 3 years, to say the least.
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason why I think a lot of Celtic fans are so excited by the return of Brendan Rodgers is largely down to the fact that he did so well at Celtic the first time around. 7 trophies out of 7. Every trophy that was possible to win under his, domestically at least, under his sort of watch, was won under Brendan Rodgers. It was a truly successful time. But that first season, I know me and you could talk about that first season for days. You've mentioned the invincible treble final. But I just want to talk about that season as a whole in general. First of all, Brendan Rodgers coming into the side. I know Rangers had beat Celtic in the semi-final of the Scottish Cup. Ronnie Dyler had resigned as manager. Celtic needed a statement manager, and they brought in Brendan Rodgers, who had recently been sacked by Liverpool. It was a statement at that point. I know it was a statement the second time around, but it was a statement the first time around. A Premier League elite manager bringing in his experience of playing in the top leagues, nearly winning the league with Liverpool. There was that buzz about the place when he came through, and that first season was just incredible, wasn't it?
It's I never kind of hide this, and I never really try and reserve anything. It's probably my favourite ever season following Celtic in my lifetime. I don't think it's between that or maybe one of the last two anyway, because it was just so fun. Just having a manager, because you got to remember before like Rodgers was announced, this was still the period of time where I felt like every name that was linked to the job was Owen Coyle, Roy Keane, all those sort of names. So then when we as soon as we appointed a manager like Brendan Rodgers, like, whoa, like this is big. And obviously it never got off to a great start. The Lincoln game was pretty dire. It was pretty eye-opening, worrying, but I think that once you take that away and then you just look at everything after that, it was like a Hollywood movie almost, just with how it all went together and how it ended especially. It's one of those ones that I'll never ever ever forget. Like in my dying breaths, I'll still be thinking about it. And that's the kind of reason that I looked back now going, well, I want Brendan Rodgers back as manager, because the times he provided me and provided the Celtic fans with through 2016 to 2018, 2019, they were just, it was phenomenal.
Yeah, I know you've mentioned this one last on your list, but I think I'm going to bring it forward with regard to the 5-1 game. It's quite incredible that you can say what 5-1 game in that season against Rangers. Such was the dominance of Celtic in that fixture over that year. But you went for the home game. I don't think you were at the away game, but the home game.
I wish.
I know it would have been one of those games that you would remember the rest of your life. But I certainly remember this one because I was at this game as well. Celtic 5, Rangers 1. I think that was the demolition derby, as they called it. Moussa Dembele. I remember going into the game, people were complaining as to why Lee Griffiths wasn't playing in this game. They weren't complaining when they were coming out.
No.
A star was born in Moussa Dembele, an absolutely dominant Celtic performance against Rangers. And you've got to remember as well the fact that there was still that bitter taste in your mouth for that previous result against Rangers in the Scottish Cup in the semi-final. You know, Celtic fans have to lap that up for a good 4, 5, 6 months before they faced Rangers again, and they put all that anger out on the team from the other end of Glasgow. What a game!
Yeah, and once again, sentimental kind of side to this one. It was my first ever derby game. I'd finally been allowed to go to a derby game. My dad is one of those ones who was like, growing up, like, nope, you're not going to a derby. You're not going. Too much violence, too much trouble. So finally got let to go to one, and it was the perfect way to start it off, wasn't it? I couldn't ask for a better one to kick off my experience of going to derby games. And I did. That's one of the main reasons I pick it, and it's one of the main reasons it stands out to me. Not only the result, but the birth of the guy's shirts that sitting behind me. I spoke about Artur Boric earlier. it's either Boric or it's him. It's Dembele. He's probably my favourite outfield player in my lifetime. A special talent. And I just remember that day, like walking down with my two mates. It was Kieran from the podcast and my pal David. We had the season ticket together. We were all walking down, and I remember like, oh, Dave, it should be Griffiths. It should be Griffiths. And me and my other pal Mark, we were saying like, nope, this is it. This is the day. This is it. Dembele's going to do it. It's what a performance. And then bang, hat trick. And I'm like, well, can't argue with that. And the rest is history. You know, that was really the start of Dembele claiming his throne as the King of Glasgow. He scored obviously 3 in that game. Then he scored at Hampden, and then he scored at Ibrox. And it just kept coming for Moussa Dembele in these big games. And you know, for as good as Lee Griffiths was the season prior, this was really the moment where Dembele just came out and went, right, well, I'm the new guy in town and I'm the best here. And that was when I felt like well and truly the Rodgers era kicked off. I felt that was the game. It was like, right, bang. Because for leading up to that, it was all the European qualifiers. And then I think we dropped a couple of points early on in the season to like Inverness or something like that as well. I don't know if that came after Rangers, actually. I can't really remember now. But I just felt like that game just bang. It set off something inside Celtic and went, right, let's make this a season to remember. No one is beating us.
Yeah, I think that Inverness game was right after the Barcelona game. I seem to remember putting the two together. Or those two games are really, really close to each other.
Memories faded. Too much winning. Memories faded.
That's it. So who else scored that game? It was a Dembele hat-trick, Scott Sinclair, and
then was it Armstrong?
Armstrong right at the end, with a lovely finish. We could talk about Scott Sinclair and his impact in that whole season as well. I know we won't speak about him when it comes to the sort of final big moment, arguably the best day of our collective lives, you would say, supporting Celtic, you could say. But it's Scott Sinclair, that first season was absolutely incredible. Talk about an impact signing in all the right ways. A guy that knew how to play under Brendan Rodgers. He played under him at Swansea, a manager that he played under in the Chelsea youth team as well. A guy that knew him inside out. They knew each other inside out, and we got a winger who was in his prime and just tore up Scotland for a good 3 seasons.
Yeah, he was unbelievable, and do you know what? I'm like one of those names that I'll say happily proved me wrong, because I remember 16-year-old me, and I wasn't making videos like the way I do now at the time, so I never really done like a reaction to the sign or anything. I'm glad I didn't, because it might be a surprise to you, I was really underwhelmed. I didn't really want us to sign Scott Sinclair. I just remember thinking to myself, Villa I think they just got relegated the year prior. And I was like, Villa have been relegated. He's been somebody who hasn't reached the level he was meant. I was like, this just strikes me as one of these English Premier League signings that are going to come up here and flop. And I was proven incredibly wrong, and I'm so happy I was, because he very quickly went from being somebody who I was so underwhelmed about signing to, when the day he left the club, somebody I was gutted about leaving, and one of my favourite players that we've seen in recent times. He was such a special talent. He had all the tools and the ability to be somebody who should have been at a higher level. I think he just needed a manager like Brendan Rodgers to really trust him and see and work with what he had. And I'm glad that he came to Celtic and found that, because the song says it. He was so wonderful, wasn't he? And he's somebody who I wished I'd have a wee bit longer at the club, I must say.
Yeah, if we'd have picked him up after Swansea, the Swansea days, or maybe even a couple of years before, I don't think Neil Lennon was the biggest fan of him, and he kind of get dropped out of the team. But that's just the way that football goes, obviously. Yeah, what a player! Obviously, that game against Hearts on his debut, he'd only signed hours before. And I think that helped a lot of the supporters get on side with Sinclair.
I mean, there's nothing like what he done to prove you can't prove somebody a dafty more, because it was that morning they signed. I was like, useless, don't want him, and then by 2:00 in the afternoon, I was, oh, what a player! Yeah, brilliant, love him. So it's probably the best sort of introduction we could have got to him, to be honest.
Yeah, just strike while the fire's hot, basically, or while the ink's not even dry yet. What a way to announce yourself to the support, and like yourself, I was doubting whether or not Sinclair had the, I don't know, maybe the physicality to hack it up here. I know he was quite a lightweight player, but that speed that he had, especially in the first 2 years, I don't know if his pace maybe dropped in the final season, or defenders knew what he was going to do with regard to the way he was playing, but his pace for those first 2 seasons was blistering. What a big game player. Did it in the Champions League as well. What a player, and very fondly remembered, and always has a good word to say about Celtic as well. When he's talking about, I know he was talking recently about Brendan Rodgers and how he was delighted that he was going back to Celtic. Just in terms of linking that back to nowadays, do you think that Brendan Rodgers for this upcoming season will need an impact player like Sinclair or like Dembele in order to realise the potential of him coming back and doing something in Europe?
Well, he's incredibly lucky that he's the team he's inheriting, obviously, because when he first came into Celtic, there was a lot of players who had to go. There was a lot of players who just weren't good enough, and then the players who we might have thought weren't good enough, he managed to as well take to another level and unlocks, your Stuart Armstrongs who he took to a next level, and guys like that. Cal McGregor, who even took to a next level as well. But he's so lucky now that he's coming in and he's inheriting a team. He's got his Dyson Maidas, he's got his Kyogos, he's got these players who have stood out, they've made an impact over the last 2 years. So now Rodgers can get even more out of them, hopefully. And obviously he's made his first few signings, which we hope can maybe have the same impact a Sinclair would and or a Dembele would, and we've got guys like, I think there's players, two in particular, in the same positions. Who's the striker, and Haksabanovic, who's a left winger. If he can find something in them that he found with Sinclair and Dembele, then they'll just be as good as new signings as well. So it's going to be really fascinating to watch how he works with these guys who are already at the club.
Yeah, because we're in a sort of middle of the road period where it was Postecoglou's team and now it's Brendan Rodgers inheriting this team. I know there's not a lot of players that were there the first time around with that are still at Celtic with Brendan Rodgers. Obviously, got Cal McGregor, James Forrest, Scott Bain, and Anthony Ralston. I think that's the four that were at the club when Brendan Rodgers was last there. So yeah, it's effectively a new team that he's got, but hopefully he can bring about the same success that he brought the first time around. I think we'll fast forward a wee bit for your next one. You're talking about an away trip that you went to, Lazio away. What a game! I know.
Still smile when I talk about it.
I know it's one of those games or one of those experiences that you talk about regularly when you're talking to me about football. But Lazio away, I think that was after Celtic had beat Lazio at home. The Julian's header. We had to go away from home. It was looking really good in the group with regard to the results that Celtic had picked up. The Celtic knew that if they'd win, they'd qualify for the next round of the Europa League, and they went behind early. But they rallied. Forrest with the goal. Forrest with a stunning goal as well. Those away from home, Forrest seems to come alive in Europe. And then last minute, 93rd, 94th minute, Olivier Ncham's free. Time stands still and he chips the goalkeeper. And it's a famous away win for Celtic in Europa League. I'll let you take the floor with what you want to say with regards to that experience in terms of the game and the trip behind it.
I still get goosebumps every time that I talk about this game in particular, but the whole trip itself was absolutely magic. And once again, I've spoke a lot of firsts in this, first derby, first game. This was my first ever time going away from home in Europe to follow Celtic. I've been lucky enough since to go all over. I've been to Germany a few times. I've been to Poland. I've been to Italy. I've been over a good few places now, but this one I couldn't have asked for a better way to start it off. And to be honest, if anything, I maybe peaked at the start because I don't think I've seen this win away from home since. But oh my god, it was just a great place, Rome. It set the location for it really, really well. Celtic going over there, and I think that we'd never won on Italian soil before that night.
We hadn't.
So that was, we got into it, and then you go down so early. I just remember thinking, you know what, I'm not going to complain because I've loved the trip. It's been cracking. I've had a lot of beers. I've had a lot of fun, seen a lot of great sights. I was like, if we lose, we lose. So I wasn't expecting much. Obviously Forrest gets us back in the game, and then you're edging towards the end, and you're just kind of thinking to yourself like, oh, well, a draw's decent. A draw's a good result. And then you say about time standing still. God, I wish that the people stood still, because if you've been in an Italian stadium, you'll know what they're like. If you've been in... Most foreign stadiums are quite similar, but they don't have fold-up chairs. It's just the actual seat. And the ground is this slidey concrete covered in beer, and it's dead steep as well in the Olympic Stadium. So I just remember in Cham's goal, hitting the back of the net, and next thing you know, you're on the floor covered in bodies. Like, you've got somebody you've never met before in your life up here, you've got your best pal there, you've got somebody else here. You're covered in bodies with just screaming voices because nobody could really take in what they just seen. And you've got to remember the quality of the goal as well. Like, and Cham having the nerve to chip the keeper that late in the game. Like, it was all just sort of like a flash and, like, once again, Hollywood ending sort of thing. Like, and the next thing you know, there's bodies absolutely everywhere. And it's one of those ones that as long as I live, I'll never, ever, ever forget, because it was just... everything just went really well throughout the entire trip. And then the fact that Celtic had, like, what, 8,000 fans there as well. It was probably our biggest European away attendance in the last decade. I can't think of any that would be bigger than that. It was just, perfect. And... you know, I remember the wee kind of mini rivalry Celtic were getting on with the Lazio fans. It felt really nice to get another win over them.
Yeah, just in terms of the trip in general, it must have been a real eye opener. Right before you go into Rome, capital of Italy, you know, Lazio, historical club. Was there any sort of run-ins with the rival fans? Did you feel safe at that point when you were in
Oh God.
Lazio or Rome?
There's a couple of funny standout stories. I remember the first night we were there. Obviously, this was like we'd all been well warned. They're like, right, stay away from these areas. Don't like antagonise. Blah blah blah. Stay away from bother unless you want yourself chopped up by some mad Lazio fan. And I remember the first night we were there. We were actually in, I'm pretty sure it was in an ice cream parlour, but it was one of the only places we could get in that had space for beers, and there was a lot of Celtic fans there. And then the next thing you know, like, these two big Riot vans just came parading round the corner, like skidding at 60 mile an hour or whatever. Like, oh, okay. And the Riot crew start piling out, and then the next thing you know, this big group of Lazio fans just like comes around the corner following them. And, like, you know, obviously people who had a wee few too many are out trying to get, right, well, I'll go and chase them. Me, I decided to run to the cubicle. I was like, yeah, I'll go and kid on him down the toilet.
Survival
instincts. Down a survival instinct. Like, I'll go to the cubicle. I was like, the time that I do the toilet, I'll come back out and it'll be done. It wasn't done. It was still going on. So just tried to keep to myself and make sure that, like, nothing was going to happen. And then I remember the after the game, we were getting the coaches. They run obviously the shuttle buses for the fans to get back to the city centre. And, like, we were all the way to the shuttle buses, we kept hearing these stories. And it was like, you know, you can't tell what's real and what's fabricated. It's like one of those ones. It starts getting out of hand a wee bit, like the still game with the power lines going off. It was a bit like that. So you hear these stories and it's like, oh, this has happened to such and such. They've been chased here. This has happened there. And you're like, right, okay. So we're on the shuttle bus back to the city centre. And then the next thing you know, poof. One of the tires on the bus had completely burst. Like, it didn't go flat; it completely, like, blew up, and the bus was, like, packed of Celtic fans. Like, way, you know, usually there's a limit on a bus, like 60 people max. There was like twice the amount of people on the bus there should have been. So suddenly the bus starts getting weighed down to one side, and we're like, right, we need to get off this bus quick. So everybody starts piling off the bus, and then the next thing you know, the police are like, oh, well, you better run back to the city centre because there's Lazio fans down the street and you're not getting another bus. So we all had to run, like this. It wasn't that long a run, it was like 5 minutes, but they're like, just run up to the bus station, just run up there. So we all had to run. This whole bus packed of people, like 5 minutes to the bus centre, just hoping that we wouldn't cross any Lazio fans on the way. So I came back unscathed, which is good, but a couple of near run-ins, you could say.
That was Celtic podcasters running with the Lazio ultras. That's as far as it goes. But at least you're here to talk to me.
At least I'm here to tell the tale. You know.
That's absolutely. And Celtic get the 3 points as well and went through to the next round of the Europa League. Obviously, we won't talk too much about that Copenhagen game. Yeah, it's still a sore one. Even 4 years on from when it happened. 3 years, just over 3 years since it happened, but. Yeah, I think we'll now move on to the sort of final one. I'm not sure if this is your favourite ever moment supporting Celtic, but it's certainly up there for at least me, and it was the Invincible treble final. Tom Rogic against Aberdeen at Hampden, you know, going 1-0 down to former Celtic player or future Celtic player in Johnny Hayes. You know, it's weird about 4 or 5 weeks later, he'd be pulling on the hoops for Celtic. It's weird how these things sort of work out. Celtic equalised quickly through Stuart Armstrong. Kieran Tierney then has to get taken off with a broken jaw,
Broken jaw,
or
aye.
he loses some teeth as well.
Big Jaden Stockley, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was Jaden Stockley
Aye.
who's now getting managed by Scott Brown at
Scott
Fleetwood.
Brown.
It's a very, very small world when it comes to football.
Yeah.
But then, as the game's dying down, and you're wondering, is there going to be a winner in this game? Tom Rogic decides to take matters into his own hands and basically run right through the Aberdeen defence and score a goal past Joe Lewis. And then what happens after? I don't know about you, but there was tears shed when that goal was scored.
Listen, I'm not one of those ones that are scared to hide my emotions, but I mean, tears would be putting it mildly.
Yeah,
I
me
was
too.
roaring and greeting like a big Wayne. And you said you don't know if it's my fate. It's for me, like, the people who were lucky enough to have Lisbon, right? And like, that'll never be topped. I'm jealous, I'm envious. I mean, we're never going to see that again. So that is literally like the best moment you can probably ever experience as a Celtic fan. But I think in terms of my generation anyway, that's probably the closest thing that we have to a Lisbon moment. Because, like, yeah, it's the Scottish Cup. Celtic have won the Scottish Cup the most times in this country. So it's like, each time, some people must not feel as special. But that year, with everything that happened, with the Invincible season being on the line, the treble being on the line, and then the fact it was do you know what? I'll say it just now, and controversially maybe, if we beat Aberdeen 4-0 that day and they were scored, we were 2-0 up by half time, it probably wouldn't have felt as special. It would have still been incredible. It would have been an achievement to last a lifetime. But the fact that Rogic scored in the fashion that he did right at the end of that game, it made it feel like, God, this is the third time I've said it, cliche. That's what you call Hollywood ending. Like, that was something out of a film script. It wasn't the thunder and lightning, the just everything about the game was straight out of a Steven Spielberg classic. And I mean, you said at the start, it's got to be my favourite ever moment following Celtic. I've never felt a euphoria like it at a game. I felt like I was just living an absolute dream. And it's sometimes hard to actually sit back and comprehend that it actually did happen, because time's moving on now. We're getting to the point where we're not far away from saying that was 10 years ago, and then suddenly it'll be 20 years, and it'll be 30 years. Scary, but it's it's
very
one of
scary.
those, just one of those ones that no matter how many years down the line you are, it'll feel like yesterday, and it'll just feel like, wow, when that happened.
Yeah, and we were both there to see it. It was an absolutely incredible day. I remember the scenes after the final whistle. Kieran Tierney getting the biggest cheer of the lot because he just came
Yeah.
back from hospital. He wasn't going to miss that treble for the world. I remember him sort of punching the badge and kissing the badge up at the top and going absolutely mental. And that I think that's why so many people are happy with the fact that Brendan Rodgers is back at the club. Although the way that he left the club 3.5 years, four
Yeah.
years ago now, the fact that those memories are still ingrained into a lot of Celtic supporters' heads, it's difficult to shake them off. And if the fans can get something similar to that in his second stint, then there'll be nobody complaining whatsoever.
No, absolutely not. I mean, that's, we seen it when he first came back through the door. There was people with their sort of, they were trying to hold back. They weren't as maybe optimistic as someone like me or you who were buzzing to see Dodgers back. But I think now that time has moved on and we start thinking of moments like that and players like that, and we hear all the stories and we see what's getting done, I think we're all pretty unanimous now. I don't see anybody who feels any sort of resentment or reserving their judgment. I feel like everybody's kind of on the same boat, and ultimately that's what's being a Celtic fan's about. We want to be all on the same page. We want to be behind the same manager, behind the same team. And back then in 2016 or 2017, sorry, when we won the cup, you could see how special the bond was between the players and the club that day, and it was something that I think that we took for granted for a while until maybe possibly, like at that moment in time, it was there, and then we lost it during COVID, and it was like, it was chaos, the world was gone. And then we looked back and went, oh, it was great. And then Ange came in and it was great again. And now I think we're all back and we're all just there. And that's how you want to always feel. And Brendan Rodgers is one of those guys that will get us feeling like that, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Just before we finish, I just wanted to, as a sort of general statement, was there any moments over the past 2 years, specifically under Postecoglou's reign at the club? I know he's obviously left
Hmm.
to join Tottenham Hotspur now, but under Postecoglou's reign, was there any moments in that time that would have potentially broke into your top five moments?
I think the standout one for most people, and it feels dead generic to say it, but I feel like the 3-0 against Rangers at Celtic Park is got to be right up there. But it's so much deeper than just beating Rangers that game. It's, the whole day was class, the late kick-off and yada yada, but that day I felt like was the real swing of the pendulum back to Celtic's dominance. That was the day that we were again on top. Even though it was coming for a number of weeks, we felt like it was going to happen and we were all on the same page and we were all confident. That day, it set the tone for the following 18 months to come. And it just really put us back where we belong. It was a blip that season during COVID. It was a blip. It should never have happened. It would never have happened if it wasn't for a pandemic. And I'll never hide in saying that. I feel like Celtic would have just kept going the way they were if it wasn't for that. And that game, that moment for me was the one that was like, we're back. That's it, fantastic. And a 3-0 at half time against Rangers on a midweek night. Oh, brilliant.
Yeah, it's almost quite mythical, that game when you think about the 60,000 fans there. The
Hmm.
sort of it was late at night. You hardly ever get these games late at night, so when they happen, I always feel as if they're more memorable if they're later on at
Hmm.
night, because I know you've got the afternoon games. They're always interesting, and you adjust your sort of routines accordingly for those
Yep.
games. But in terms of in terms of 19 games, I think we were both at university that day as
We
well.
were, we
We were
were,
talking about
aye.
it. We had to make the journey back from Ayr, and then we
Aye.
made the journey into town for the game. But yeah, it was one of those games that you could feel the tide was turning in terms of the title race. Rangers had dropped points in a couple of games before that, but
Hmm.
now was the chance to sort of get back on top of the table, from a position that it looked as if it wasn't going to be possible given the start to the season that Postecoglou did have at Celtic.
Yep.
To then turn that around and not really look back from that point. It was a massive game, one of the most sort of momentous games I think in
Yeah. So
in
much
modern Celtic
significance to
history.
it, man. Aye. So much significance to it. And, it was somebody like, I don't want to like drag it on forever. There's so much you could dissect from the game. But a guy like Rio Hatate, that was a real, that was him arriving at Celtic
Yeah,
that night and stuff like that. It set the tone for where we are now. And I know Ange isn't here anymore. He's moved on. But, if it wasn't for that night, then I don't know. Things could have been really different. Like,
I know it's one of those ones. I guess we'll never know with regards
aye,
to with regard to that. Just before we finish, and thank you very much for coming on and joining me on the
my
Celtic We
pleasure.
Sit Down. Where can the viewers that maybe haven't watched your stuff or aren't familiar with your stuff, where can they find you?
Well, of course, my Twitter's on the screen, so if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can do that. But my YouTube channel is Ryan118. Well, on the road to 40,000 subscribers, so if you haven't, it would be appreciated to come and subscribe.
Yeah, one of the big dogs of the Celtic YouTubing scene. We're trying to get up to that level as well, but baby steps. But just before we finish, as I said at the start of the video, if you want to further support everything we do at the Celtic Way, then subscribe to the Celtic Way website and support top quality football journalism covering the club you love, with scouting pieces, big match verdicts, Q&As, big interviews throughout the week as well, opinion pieces sort of daily, and scouting pieces as well. If you visit www.celticway.co.uk/subscribe, and you'll find all the stuff there. Ryan, all that's left for me to say is thank you very much for joining me, and thanks for sharing all your moments with regards to favourite memories at Celtic.
My pleasure, mate. Thanks for having me on. I enjoyed that.
And thanks to everybody for tuning in and joining, and we'll see you on the next video. Cheers, guys.